What's up, guys? Today we're going to be looking at the US dollar versus multiple currencies. I think there's a lot to take out of this, and for a lot of you fundamentalists who have been studying what's been going on with our monetary system, king dollar, and such, I think from a technical perspective, you're going to get a lot more clarity as to when these things might start to transition. Um, I was I was recently looking at the dollar versus multiple currencies after not doing it for such a long time. I think now with the recession, we have to pay attention to the implications on the global economy, and if we're going to see a shift in perspective, if we're going to see that kind of paradigm shift where maybe the dollar begins to lose its reserve status, because I think there's some very good cases, some very good points that could be made for either case, where whether you think the dollar is going to strengthen significantly versus a lot of these currencies, or whether it's going to get weaker and devalue. So, my intuitive belief is that the dollar is going to significantly strengthen over multiple years. I think we're going to go through a deflationary episode, and after that, we're going to see inflation really begin to pick up. But from a technical perspective, I'm really starting to see a different picture being painted. And I think this picture that's being painted is part of a paradigm shift we are going to see very, very soon. So before I continue, it's not financial advice. Please do your own due diligence. Past performance is never an indicator of future performance. So as I always say on this page, research, research, research. So I want to dive into it. I was looking at a lot of different currencies, and I noticed some similar trends amongst many different currencies, and I believe that this is painting a picture of what is to come in the world. So, for starters, I was looking at the pound versus the dollar, the euro versus the dollar, the Australian dollar versus the US dollar, and the New Zealand dollar versus the US dollar. And one pattern I noticed was a lot of these are forming descending wedges. You can see the wedges right here. Multi-year wedges, multi-year wedges, multi-year wedges. And for the pound, I think we're seeing this huge wedge that really began in 2002. So, from 2007, like this is a multi-year wedge that is about to break out. These wedges are typically reversing patterns, whether it's an ascending wedge, which is going upward, kind of like what we see in Bitcoin right now on the 4-hour chart, which is signaling to me that we go short. But these descending wedges are reversal patterns they're typically bottoming patterns. And it seems like with a lot of these currencies, New Zealand, Australia, the euro, and the pound, they're getting very close to bottoming out. And when they break out of these wedges, that's going to signal to us that there is a trend changing. Now, whether that trend goes straight up, usually it doesn't work like that. What you usually see is a wedge like this break, and for multiple years you consolidate. So I think we could be looking at a multi-year consolidation where you're going to be able to play this range and make a lot of money if you're into trading currencies. Same with the euro. I think we're going to start to break up. And the Australian dollar, I think we're seeing the same thing. Now, what does this mean for the dollar? Well, the dollar has been strengthening significantly over the past few years. I think a lot of people have been running. There's been a lot of fleeting to the dollar. The dollar is considered a safe haven, and I think this shift we're seeing in these four currencies, which are very strong currencies, also just to keep in mind, very strong currencies themselves. They're very strong economies, respectively. Maybe not New Zealand as much, but Australia, Europe, and England are very, very strong economies. And now I think what we're seeing is they're going to strengthen a lot versus the dollar. And we're seeing this paradigm shift where maybe the dollar is going to start losing reserve status. What does this mean in terms of Australia, Europe, and Great Britain? Well, perhaps instead of people rushing to the safe haven dollar, we're probably going to see a lot more liquidity start going into areas like Great Britain, like Europe, Australia, New Zealand. So what are the implications of that to the US dollar? Well, this could mean that we could be approaching a period where we're starting to see a shift, whereas before a lot of dollars used to flow in, a lot of capital used to flow in to the US, we may be seeing this shift where investors are instead going to look elsewhere. We could be looking at a time period for America where we could see very weak and low returns because we're not seeing this liquidity pickup. We could be seeing a shift in confidence with the dollar. So this is very, very significant. This could be the beginning of the end for the dollar, just from these currencies starting to show a lot more strength versus the dollar. It could start serving as alternatives to the dollar. So that's why this is so significant to me. Even if it does range like this for multiple years, it's signaling that people are no longer trusting the dollar as much as they would trust these currencies, and the price is telling us that. When the price, when the price is low, that means that there's not a lot of demand for these currencies. But when the price starts to rise, it means that there's a lot more demand and a lot more investors and a lot more liquidity entering the system, a lot more demand for pounds, a lot more demand for euros, a lot more demand for Australian dollars, New Zealand dollars. So this could be one factor that's kind of signaling in that the dollar is losing its status, and it's starting to shift soon. It's going to happen really soon because we've seen the dollar strengthen versus these currencies for so long. And I think now we're getting to the point where this reversal is going to begin. Now, looking at the Japanese yen, nope, no upgrade, won't do it. So the yen, it's kind of a different story. We're seeing this pennant kind of playing out. And, Japan's a very interesting economy. It's been in deflation for multiple decades. It has extremely high debt to GDP ratio, and they have a huge demographic issue, and they're really trying to find ways to stimulate their economy. And it looks like they may be turning the corner. And from a technical perspective, Japan's a little harder to analyze because we really don't know what's going to happen. But I do believe that if you notice, after the 2008 crisis, we saw a lot of liquidity start to flow into Japan, especially after Bear Stearns they dumped. We saw that final dump, and then we saw it really begin to strengthen. And Japan had some really great years, while the US had bottomed. And I think that's quite significant because we're kind of approaching the same point where the US looks like it's going to go into a huge deflationary environment. So it'll be really interesting to see if Japan can conquer this, 0.009801 level. Basically, 0.0098, right? Now, if Japan can get over this hump, especially while US is in a huge episode, a deflationary episode, we can see it rise quite a bit, and we could see a lot of money start flowing into Japan and a lot of demand going into Japan, you could see a huge move. Once we get over this line, we've seen huge spikes up. And I would expect the same thing. And I'm thinking that after it's all said and done, the worst part is over for the US when we start really seeing it tank and we start seeing the defaults and the mortgage-backed securities collapsing and the index funds, all the liquidity flowing out. I think we're going to start to see a big run into the yen. And I think the yen is going to start really strengthening, kind of like we saw in 2008, 2000, from 2008 to really 2011, 12. And interestingly enough, we saw gold top out around here. We saw gold have a topping, it hit 1800 around there, just at the same time that Japan topped out. So to me, what that kind of tells me is Japan is a safe haven. It's treated as a safe haven, contrary to the belief Japan is a place where people really love to go to. Because how much more can it deflate? It's been, deflating since the 80s, you know. So it's interesting to see how Japan's reacted when US was doing really bad and when gold was doing really good. We saw a huge run into Japanese equities. So I think the same thing is setting up here where eventually, regardless if we break down from this pennant, I think it'll just give a better opportunity to enter in. I don't see a lot of weakening in the Japanese yen. I think eventually, the trend, it changes. Yeah, eventually this trend changes. One drop perfect line. You'll never get a perfect. That's what I've learned. But we saw a nice little rejection right here at this confluence, and I think it may squeeze, but eventually we could start seeing a lot of strength in Japan and Japanese equities. So that's something I'm very, very interested in now. Looking at the Swiss franc, which is usually pretty correlated with the US dollar, we're seeing kind of like a descending triangle, and this could be considered a wedge, but now this is where I like to tie in the fundamental analysis. Now the Swiss franc it holds a lot of there's a pretty heavy correlation. It serves as a safe haven for the US dollar. To the US dollar, Swiss banking is very important to our industry, especially for our elites. And I think what we're seeing here is we're seeing a squeezing, and this pattern is going to start to break out, sometime after 2023. After 2023, we're going to see a move, whether we break down or break up. I'm not too sure, but it looks like, this is also forming a wedge where a big move is going to be made, whether it's going to go up or down. Singapore dollar. Now this one's a little more interesting because we do see a descending triangle, descending wedge, but this is a lot further away from materializing than like the pound, the euro, the Australian dollar, or the New Zealand dollar. The Singapore dollar seems to be squeezing through a wedge where it's getting significantly weaker, and that's going to probably take more time to play out before we see the move sometime after, probably 2025, so after our next elections. And what does that tell me? Well, let's actually look at the Russian ruble too, because we're seeing something very similar with the Russian ruble. We kind of see this, you could say it's a descending triangle. I'm not really too sure right now, but we do see a downtrend coming, and whether we break up from it or we break down, that is to be determined. Usually these descending triangles usually break down, so much similar to Singapore. I mean, these are Eastern economies, and the big debate is, the big rivalry is the East versus the West. You got the Russians, Chinese, um, a lot of these emerging markets versus King Dollar, Great Britain, Europe, Australia, um, etc. So, so what we're seeing with the Russian ruble is we've seen it, really decrease in strength. We've seen it increase versus the dollar, and now it's kind of bottomed out here. Could expect a little relief, a little strength in the ruble, and then I think we're gonna start seeing this pattern make its move. Usually, a triangle like this, it breaks downward. Like I said, not really too sure if this is a triangle or not. We did see that big dip right there, and then we kind of bounced right here, we kind of bounced right here, so it'll be interesting to see where we go. I expect it to break down. If it does break down for a while, I think it'll be a few years consolidation, then a reversal begins. And this kind of aligns with what we're seeing with the Singapore dollar, where it's kind of consolidating, not really making its move, but it's going to have a big pop. And I think this pop could be down, could be up. I'm expecting it to break up. So this is where I'm kind of painting my bias as to which way I think it's going to go. Obviously, as a conservative trader, you only want to trade the breakouts, so that'd be my recommendation if you want to play it safe. But the ruble, it's kind of it's painting the same picture, where it's going to be going in a downtrend for a while, but a decision is going to be made versus the dollar. Looking at the India rupee, this one's very interesting to me. We see this channel forming, and you could make a case that this is a ascending triangle that's kind of forming and squeezing up until 2023, 2024. It could break down, but I'm just going to delete this for a second. It's also quite possible that this is in a long-term channel, and it's going to continue to get weaker and weaker for the next several years. This could happen for several years, but I think the moment it breaks this channel right here, we're going to start seeing a reversal, because this channel has been forming since 2008. Kind of broke down right here, but quickly got back in, and it's just been on par to kind of continue to move up for several years. Let's look at the yuan, the US dollar and the yuan. This one's very interesting. So what we're seeing here is we saw this kind of pattern right here kind of form, right? We saw this channel that the yuan was moving in, and eventually it broke down from it. So right now what we're seeing is, this was a huge level. We just got over this level. We've retested the bottom of this channel, and now we're it seems like we're forming another multi-year channel and this could go on for several years. We're kind of in price discovery now. So how long can the Chinese yuan weaken versus the dollar, and how significant will that be? Not too sure. But it looks like at the moment it's gonna just continue to get weaker. Looking at the dollar index, we see, so I just want to point out that we saw this rising channel with the dollar from, really 92, and then we started going up, and we moved up until the 2000s, and then we really started to shoot down up until 2004, and then by 2008, the bottoming, by the time the crisis was over, we had started this new channel, which the dollar seems to be moving in now. What is going to happen here? I think we're going to continue to strengthen for several years, the DXY, and then eventually we're going to see it start to break down. And this kind of aligns with my thesis of us going into a deflationary crisis, and then we could see the dollar really start to strengthen, and then it could just kind of change, break this channel, and reverse. So tying it all together, what is this picture painting? So we've looked at all these currencies. What picture is this painting to me? What I'm seeing, and I'm going to do a video kind of talking about the fundamentals of a lot of these economies and the East versus West debate and looking at Europe. So I'm going to do analysis, really breaking that down so you can understand the fundamentals. But from a technical perspective, to me, what it looks like is we're going to see Western economies start to recover a little quicker than the dollar. We're going to see Great Britain, Europe, Australia, New Zealand start to get out this recession sooner, perhaps, or their currencies are going to start to strengthen sooner. We're going to see liquidity start flowing within the next few years. I think the dollar is going to get strong for a while, and eventually these patterns are going to reverse. And more money is going to start flowing into these countries. Looking at the Japanese yen, I think if we go into a deflationary crisis and a global liquidity crisis in America, Japanese equities are going to look very, very attractive as money flows in and it's treated as a safe haven. I think Japanese equities are going to do well, especially if we get over this line. So I'll be curious to see if, after our crisis or we see stock market really start to bottom out, I'll be very curious to see where the Japanese yen is and if it starts to show significant strength after, while stocks are still low. If the yen starts to show significant strength, I think there's going to be a very great opportunity in Japanese equities. The Swiss franc, not really too much to paint there, but it is forming a pattern where it's going to have to make a decision whether to break up, break down. The Singaporean dollar, this is very interesting. I think Singapore is a very strong economy. I think they have very strong fundamentals, and they could be a very, very, very attractive place to invest in. And yes, the currency may get weaker, but I think what we're going to see is this looks a little more like a wedge to me. It could break down, obviously, but if we see a breakout around 2025, 2026, I think that's going to really shift. That's going to be a huge shift where many more dollars, or I shouldn't say dollars, a lot more liquidity is going to start flowing into this country over the dollar. It's going to strengthen at a much faster rate than the dollar. The dollar could get stronger while the Singaporean dollar gets even stronger, right? But it looks to me like there's going to be a reversal, but it's going to take some time. It's a few years away from making this decision, but when it breaks out, I think that's going to be a significant shift in the way people think, where a lot more people are going to want to start investing into Singapore. And I think we could very well see the same thing where the Russian economy begins to open up. It's in this descending, triangle. I think it's going to break down. I think it's going to consolidate for a few years. And we'll just have to pay attention to what happens once. I think we're going to break down. So if we break up, obviously, that's going to be a whole different story. It's going to consolidate for multiple years. But I think there's going to start to be a trend, a paradigm shift where people are going to start looking into the Russian economy. The rupee looks like it's going to continue to get weaker versus the dollar because remember, most of these charts, it's the pound versus the dollar. So, it costs $1.22 to buy 1 pound. The euro, it costs, $1.08 to buy a euro. The Australian dollar, it costs 60 cents to buy the Australian dollar. But for the rupee, I have it it's an inverse relationship. So 76 rupees equal $1. And it looks like this trend is going to continue for multiple years. But you know, if we start to see this trend shift around the same time we see the Singaporean dollar shift and the Russian economy start to shift, and even the Chinese, the yuan. If we see the yuan, it could go up for multiple years. I think China's a little bit of a special case that we're going to have to analyze at a later time. But if we see money start flowing and strength, and we see more strength in these economies, or in these currencies versus the dollar, I think that's really painting the picture that less people are going to want to invest in the US, and instead they're going to look for alternatives like Singapore, Russia, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, Europe, Great Britain. This could be the end of King Dollar, much to Americans' dismay. I know it's going to affect me quite a bit, but it looks like this is the picture that's being painted. That, first, people are going to start looking into Great Britain, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, perhaps Japan even. And then, towards a few years later, I think we're going to start seeing even more money start flowing into other places, like, well, not Swiss franc, like Singapore, like Russia, the rupee, and China. So, to me, what I'm seeing is, the dollar. I've always believed it's on its last legs, and I think we're starting to see how it's going to play out. It looks like Europe is going to show a lot of strength, and a lot of people are going to flock to Europe as a safe haven, and eventually people are going to look for opportunities in these emerging markets like Singapore, Russia, US, no, not US, India, and China. So fundamentally, we could look into that a little more, but I think we are seeing that paradigm shift now, and I think the dollar is really losing grips on its reserve status. Of course, this could change if we see breakdowns in these currencies, over the next few years. This is going to take a few years to play out, but I think it's important to really talk about this now because it looks to me like other Western countries are going to begin to show strength in their currencies versus the dollar, and over the next 5 to 10 years, we could start seeing more strength in emerging markets. So, what does that tell us now? Well, emerging markets are probably going to suffer for a lot longer than most people think. Japan could be close to really bottoming out. Um, this could be, especially if we get over this level again, I think we could stay above this level, and eventually Japanese currency could really start to shine. And whether gold does with it as well, that will be another story for another day, because yeah, we really don't know. But since gold bottomed out in like 2001, 2002, I want to say 2000 maybe it bottomed out. Um, it's been on this huge run, so it'll be interesting to see how people treat Japan during this time. And then yeah, this is a paradigm shift, people. So really brace yourself for what's happening, because the world is going to change right before our eyes over the next decade or two. And my fears are that with the dollar, people are not going to want to, Americans, the US, they're not going to want to give up that status easily. I think we're headed towards a very politically unstable world, and geopolitically, I think we're going to see a lot of tensions all around the world. Not that we're not seeing them now, but I think they're going to very well start to intensify over the years as we see these currency wars unfold. Yeah, and I think this is what this is. it's a huge currency war that's about to take place over the next several years, and the way it plays out, I'm not too sure, but we'll look into this more later. If you like the video, like, subscribe, comment, and let me know what you think. Let me know what you fundamentally understand. I would love to hear all of your opinions. So subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below on what you think, and there's going to be more videos coming out like this, so stay tuned. Alright, you guys have a good one, and we'll see you next time.